Welcome back to the Buddy Ruski Show. For those keeping score at home, this is episode 17. My guest today is Saleem Reshamwala. Saleem is a videographer based here in Durham, North Carolina. Our relationship dates way back to my early days at Runaway. Even if his name doesn't sound familiar, there's a good chance you've seen his work if you've been following me over the last decade. I don't know how you could have missed the North Cac video. Saleem has been one of my fondest relationships in the business. He is incredibly wise and considerate, always tinkering and experimenting. He never settles for the status quo and is constantly thinking about how we can improve everyday life through an out-of-the-box approach. You'll hear some of that in our conversation as we discuss the future of education and how technology has changed his own approach to filmmaking. As always, thank you for listening. I can't say that enough. It continues to be a really hard year and then some, but this show and this work at Buddy Ruski has been an anchoring force of positivity for me and hopefully for you as well. I look forward to bringing great stories to you for years to come, but I could use your help. I'm sure some of you have heard the phrase, trying to buy back your time. Well, that's where I am right now. With so many ideas and limited time, I'm working on other things to honor my financial responsibilities. I dream of a day when I can make podcasts and videos and write with every waking minute of every day, bringing you the stories you so deserve. This is where you come in. Consider becoming a Patreon subscriber to fuel this engine to its max capacity. If you are already a subscriber, I thank you sincerely. Well, without further ado, here's my conversation with Saleem Reshamwala. Bring the horns in. Saleem Reshamwala, thanks so much for being on the Busky Rudy Show today.
Thank you for having me, man. I'm surprised it's taken us this long to do it. I'm glad to be here.
I know. I think the last time that we chatted on mic was maybe for Super Empty with our buddy Ryan and Holland as well for the Super Empty podcast back in maybe 2018. So it's
yeah, I think that's right. We were discussing the This Is America video, and then we dove into North Cac and some videos I've directed and just kind of chatted about hip hop music videos.
Which I know has been, when I first became aware of your career, that was what you were doing, pretty connected to Tune and Law, doing music videos for them. But obviously you have built up the skills and talent to get to that point and do all the amazing things that you do. So I'd really love to start way back when and just have you talk a little bit about how you got where you are. I know you've bounced around a little bit. You are not a North Carolina native, so maybe how you got to North Carolina, or you are a North Carolina native actually.
I consider myself from here, but I didn't actually move here till I moved here when I was 12. So, I think of myself as a Southerner. I moved to the South when I was 4. Born in Jersey, but moved to the South when I was 4. So, Jersey hasn't done much to try and keep me or to claim me. I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, which is in Florida, but on the panhandle, so very southern. I don't know if you know this about Florida, but the farther north you are in Florida, the more southern you are culturally in Florida.
Huh. Okay. I will try to figure that out. I do have a college degree, so I think I can make that work. We will certainly claim you here in the South.
I appreciate it.
So, but yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about getting to North Carolina, what it was like growing up in the Panhandle in Florida, how that might have shifted your perspective a little bit, and then how you got into storytelling really as a profession.
Yeah, my dad is a storyteller. If you ever meet him, you're gonna hear him tell stories. And he grew up my dad's from Mumbai, India, formerly Bombay, which is how I always heard it in stories. And ever since I was little, I always heard him, just telling wild stories about the block that he's from. So, I always feel like my origin always starts with my parents. My mom is born in Japan, so was just hearing like kind of international stories a bunch. And my dad's stories, he's from this neighborhood called Bindi Bazaar, which is, I later found out there's actually a genre of like kind of B grade gangster movie that takes place in Bindi Bazaar. It's not actually like super dangerous. It's just like this weird image that occurred. But my dad would have all these crazy stories. Like, he'd tell me about a guy in front of his house who had a mannequin with bells so that kids could practice being pickpockets. They'd try and pick the pockets of the mannequin without ringing a bell. Like just all these like kind of wild stories, like him being a kid and entering a science fair around the time of Sputnik and claiming that he was contacting Sputnik and winning this school competition, and it later causing a ton of problems when it was revealed that he had, this is terrible, but he was a kid. He had a little tiny battery that was shocking a little mouse inside a box, and claimed that he was getting signals from Sputnik, but it was a mouse being agitated. The mouse was fine. He kept the mouse as a pet.
That mouse went on to do great things. I'm sure.
Yeah. I'm sure the mouse. We'll pretend the mouse was better for it. If you're listening, don't shock a mouse, but be happy for this mouse because I'm sure it's fine. So yeah, I just heard those kind of stories growing up, and lived like I said, grew up in the South, which is a very, Pensacola, Florida was a very we lived in a very front porch, iced tea out of a glass jar, typical Southern suburb, 15 minutes from the beach. So, headed back and forth a bunch there. But like the thing that I would say is I didn't put this together really until later. Like there were no other mixed race kids in my orbit as a little kid. And I self-interpreted that as like I am weird, but I didn't really think all the time of like, oh, I'm weird because, I wasn't always like, oh, I'm a mixed race kid, that's why I'm weird. But like I kind of embraced it. There's this tape in my house of a show I made called Weird Max Radio Show. And it's like this radio show that I made my brother and sister help me with. We didn't watch baseball in my house. I didn't know anything about baseball. And I had a whole sports segment where I narrated a baseball game. It's insane. It's like the there's just me yelling random baseball phrases with names that I had heard. So it's like, Ronald Reagan sliding into first base. You're listening to Weird Max Radio. We're really weird. Like just, wackiness. I really think it did have Ronald Reagan sliding into first base. And moved to North Carolina when we were 12. Yeah, no, it was 12. I was 12. Yeah, I moved to North Carolina when I was 12. That's right. Moved to Mooresville first. Mooresville, North Carolina when I was 12. And, had switched schools like 4 times in 2.5 years. And was always trying to find a way to fit in, right? When I went to West Cary, and I remember this, I was there for 6 months or something. And I remember this girl was like, the clothes you wear, were they cool where you came from? It was like just, I was just brutally jumping between, schools. When you're 12, every school is so different.
Yeah.
And every school has its own subculture. It's not like part of a scene where, so you just don't know how to be cool in this new place, and you're trying to figure it out.
And you're the oldest of 3, is that right?
Yeah, I'm the oldest of 3. Yeah.
Did your siblings have a similar experience, or were you able to blaze a path for them in any way?
No, it's a great question. I didn't realize until I was in my 20s that I was talking to my brother about being mixed race, and he was like, what? And I was like, we're mixed race. And he was like, oh yeah, but I just thought of myself as an Indian kid. And it's because he just looks more Indian than me. So, so much of race and ethnicity, it's weird because there's how you identify yourself, and obviously that's important, but there's also just you can kind of, for practical purposes, become what you're perceived in some ways, So, no, I think for all of us, we've all had racial unusualness in our lives. But yeah, I actually remember really the moments where I was felt oh, I'm kind of good at this weird thing, or maybe it's not even about being good at it. It's just being really in the zone and feeling oh, I'm flowing while I'm doing this weird thing, which when I was in 7th grade, I had this great teacher, Miss Ramey, and I used to always get in trouble in her class, and she'd make us write essays. And
As punishment.
as punishment. And I would love to talk to her about this, but I think after a while she was just like basically assigning me essays, like creatively assigning me essays. I would write insane essays about like, I don't know, I'd be writing about like why I shouldn't talk in class, and somehow there'd be like, it might disturb like the ghosts of dead soldiers, like these just insane, like surrealistic essays. I mean, maybe she hated them, and maybe I'm making this all up in my head, but I had a friend, Andy McLaurin, who somehow never got in trouble. If you're listening to this, Andy, I don't know, man, buy me a lunch or something. I still see the dude around. But he never got in trouble. He never had to write essays. But I remember him and some of my friends would read the essays and laugh a lot. And that was like kind of like, oh, like I'm entertaining people. And that was a school, Apex Middle School, was where I like started fitting in, and it was by like being goofy and telling stories and stuff like that, So that was kind of the start of it, if you're looking for like the real start.
And how did your parents decide on Florida and then North Carolina, coming from across the world?
Yeah, my dad just worked for a chemical company that had him moving around. That was an era where like lots of companies were like consolidating headquarters, and eventually so many companies had their headquarters moved to North Carolina. So tons of kids were getting transferred into this area around that time.
I'm assuming that's thanks to Research Triangle Park.
Yeah, that's all RTP, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you end up in North Carolina when you're 12, and you start to build a knack for storytelling. You said that your dad, like I think many of our elders, are great storytellers and have lots of wisdom that they're able to pass along. Were they? I mean, I know that the stereotype for a lot of immigrant parents is pushing their children into very specific fields. Did you have any of that pressure when you were growing up to sort of fulfill a pathway, or was storytelling a potential option for you at that age?
Yeah, I think in my parents' defense, I think, my dad, really had done the typical immigrant story, and it had come from not a lot in India, and it really worked his way up. And I think I didn't make it easy for them because I didn't understand what I was doing. Like I wasn't really making a clear pitch of like, hey, I'm going to do this thing and here's why it's going to be okay. I was just like I remember there was a cereal called Blueberry Morning, and I read the back of the box of this Blueberry Morning cereal, and it was like, you awake in the morning, you walk behind your small house and into the blueberry fields. The sun is... It was like this insane story about like how you're picking blueberries. And I'd only ever seen like crossword puzzles on the back of cereal boxes or whatever. And I saw that and I was like, yo, this is what I want to do. I want to write cereal boxes. And I was pretty small, but like that like started this thing where I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to write like this kind of thing or that kind of thing. And I just say super random stuff, So I wasn't really like presenting a clear plan to my parents. So they were maybe, justified in wanting to have... My dad, especially, was maybe justified in wanting to have a better understanding of what the heck I was going to do. And I was really unclear, like I went to college and didn't really, like came in as computer science, not even knowing that at the time UNC didn't really have a computer science major. It was like bundled into the math department.
When was this?
This is like, I graduated in 96.
Okay.
So I graduated high school in 96. So, it wasn't actually that people weren't programming computers at UNC at the time. Yeah. It was just like under the math degree, and I didn't really understand that. And there's a lot, if you're not from a family where everyone kind of went through, like if you're going to a liberal arts school and you're not from a family where everyone went through a liberal arts school, there's like a lot of confusing steps in that. Like I applied to such a random sampling of schools, and once I got there, didn't really know that like I've talked to friends now who are like, I met with my advisor every week and figured out, and I'm like, I didn't do any of that stuff.
I can tell you, having graduated in 2008 and also going into college as a computer science major, that not much had changed in those 12 years.
It's one of the craziest things that like, college is a lot to navigate. And So much of it is just random chance.
Did either of your parents have any college experience?
Yeah. So my dad got a master's in chemistry.
Okay.
It's a much clearer path. It's kind of a science-based path, and he finished that in the U.S. So he did his undergrad, in India, and did his master's here. My mom is a nurse, so and she was always just very open to whatever I was doing, but had kind of a clear path behind her. And I just think it's like you show up at a liberal arts university, and there's this cool idea of like, oh, like you can do anything, but you don't know what anything is. I don't mean that in like a disparaging way about like youth don't know anything. I just mean it in a literal sense of like I worked as a graphic designer coming out of college, but coming into college, I did not know what a graphic designer was. And I don't think that's that unusual. Maybe it's somewhat more common now, but like there's just so many professions where, you here's a thing I think about, like letting my 18-year-old self plan my current day and what I do for money is an insane idea. Like in the sense that like an 18-year-old wouldn't let a 12-year-old plan his day. Like it's just asking people to make decisions for their future selves without a lot of knowledge is pretty hard, man.
Yeah, and with a liberal arts degree of any kind, really, whether it's doing something like graphic design or being a psychology major or any of those, there are so many, well, I shouldn't say there are so many opportunities, but with the exception of like, psychology major becoming a psychologist in a very practical sense, there aren't really like concrete, the career that you take or the path that you take is a little more abstract. And even with something like graphic design, it's like, okay, cool, you can draw, but like, how do you start to find jobs that will pay you to draw? Whereas, with engineering or, with something as like being a nurse, it seems like it's a pretty simple path. You go, you learn how to be a nurse, and then you go to a hospital or a doctor's office and you just be a nurse at a place where everyone knows that, you can find nurses. Whereas like graphic designers, and I'm sure it's changed over time, but it seems like it's not as simple or obvious.
Yeah, and the other thing is nobody knows what everyone else is doing all day. Like I don't even as a full-grown adult, like what are my friends doing all day? Like they tell me some job title, I don't really know what the day in, day out of that job is, right? So I heard this quote once, I'm going to butcher it, but it's basically like, it was like, oh, do you want to be a novelist? Great. Okay, so you might say yes to that question. And if somebody rephrases it and they're like, do you want to sit in a room all day alone making up complicated lies about the world? No, I don't want to do. But that's what a novelist is. Like you don't know what
Right.
what that is all day. Like a filmmaker, you don't. It's hard to see what the full day of an average day of a filmmaker is because these things aren't always super fascinating to explain bit by bit, or in a 30-second TV commercial or whatever. So people's day-to-day lives are such a mystery until you've actually tried it. I heard this quote that I think about a lot, and I'm gonna butcher it again. I'm paraphrasing it, but it's like, at first I thought I should figure out what I wanted to do so I could go in the world and do it, but then I learned that I should go into the world to do things to figure out what I want to do. And that's really stuck with me. I want to say I'm butchering a Hemingway quote, which, I mean, that sounds kind of classy.
If you butcher
right?
it bad enough, I think you can just claim it as your own.
Yeah, maybe that's what I should just push it far enough that it's my own. Yeah, we'll give it 5 or 6 more iterations, and when it actually doesn't make sense, then I'll actually claim it as my own. But yeah, the gist of it just being that, like, I just think it's a lot when you're in college to try and really make an accurate guess. I mean, much less when you're 18 and you like declare whatever rando major you put on a paper is, to make an accurate guess as to like what you want to do for a certain number of hours every day when you don't know what that life is like.
I think you're spot on. There's so many. I think the college college education reform is coming very soon. If it's not here already, and just, when you couple people going into college and not knowing what they want with the enormous amount of debt that we're all going into to do that, it seems like a bygone era to go straight into 4-year college, knowing what you want right at 18 and coming out with a job that's going to pay you well enough to buy a house, buy a car, and get married, have a career, that sort of thing. And you're right. I mean, I changed majors 3 times in the span of 4 years. Part of that being in school, part of it not. Like, I came in as a computer science major, stayed in college for a semester, was out of school for a year, went back to Durham Tech thinking I was going to become a teacher. About a year later, changed my mind and wanted to be an English literature major. Ended up being a communications major, which is comparable but not quite the same thing. And yeah, it's just like, but a lot of it came from experience, like you said.
Yeah.
It came from the different things, the different jobs that I had over that time, the different things I was exposed to over the time, the people I encountered shifted my perspective, and I became more familiar with what it was that I was good at and where that met the opportunities that were available to me and what I wanted to spend my time with every day. And so, yeah, I can't imagine in the next 10 years that post high school education / career development will look like it did when we were coming up.
Well, I always wonder what would something like college look like if it didn't exist. If somebody was like, okay, cool. So, we have all this background knowledge that actually kind of confuses us, right? Like, so we know that just about the best way for anyone to go up in, I'm going to use really rough terminology, but in class, for lack of a better word, an easier way to put it is just purely brutally speaking in income bracket. In general, if your family is in a lower income bracket and you want to go to a higher income bracket, in America, on average, going to college is a good way to do that. But that's not what college was designed for originally, way, way back in the day when these academies were first kind of formed. And if you were trying to redesign the system, I'm curious, and more power to people for whom the current system works, they should definitely keep using the same system. I'm curious, what would it be like to do, what if you went to college a year, once every 3 years, and, spread it out over 16 years or whatever it is, and you're going to college for whatever the number is for you, the number's 8 years, it's 12 years, it's whatever it is. And you were able to do deep dives. I would love to do a year of college right now. That sounds amazing. And it would be a very, very different experience than when I was there.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because over the course of this year during the pandemic, one of the first things that I thought about when the initial stimulus checks came in, it was what classes is Durham Tech offering right now? It's just I didn't have the time, or, I guess maybe I had the finances, but didn't have the time to really think about going back to school when I was working full time. But now it's man, I have all this free time on my hands. This would be a great opportunity to learn something or relearn something, or pursue something that I'm mildly interested in and see if there's a career path in that. And the taking a year of college every 3 years mentality is a pretty interesting rabbit hole that would be worth exploring.
And it's cool because, there's a few things that college offers which are great. Well, I mean, one is it's great to be able to take super random stuff that you have no idea if you're going to use, but you're super interested in, right? So that's one area where it's a huge blessing and gift, and it's hard maybe when you're 18 and it's the first time you're living away from home to dive into everything in the same way that you might when the timing is right, But the other thing that's interesting about what you're talking about now is okay, so right now you just right before we got on the phone call, you were talking about a class you took this morning, and it's that's a class where you're going to apply that knowledge maybe tomorrow, if I was to offer you this book and it's a 5-minute lesson on what to do when you're attacked by a bear, you might be like, cool, man, I'm kind of busy right now. But if I was like, bro, we're 5 minutes away from a bunch of bears and you don't really have a choice, like we're about to be around a bunch of bears, you're going to really read that book, and like, so even this year I'm actually taking like 3 online courses about stop motion right now because I had a couple stop motion projects and because it's quarantine madness and we don't know, it's hard to schedule physical interaction with other people, but I know I can film things in my shed, so that's what I'm going to focus on. But all those classes are getting applied super immediately, right? So I've actually, throughout my career, I've gotten a surprising amount of value from online courses or I didn't go to film school, but I have spent money on like 2-day seminars or whatever to learn as I go.
I wonder so there is something, like I have this idea in my head of, for all the folks that, our parents, they start these college, if we're lucky enough, there's a college savings that's happening throughout our life. And then when we get to 18 and we're thinking about school, we either take out more money or, maybe our families are able to cover it, but we have this like lump sum of money that we're about to put towards education. And if you were to just take that money and say, okay, here are a couple things that I'm interested in, to your point, like, let me take one class. Let me just drop $300 or whatever it costs to take this one course and see, like, do it. Because I think for me, I could have saved a whole semester of college if they had just told me, you're actually going to hate C++. And so you shouldn't become a computer scientist. I would have been like, okay, cool. Like, then I probably shouldn't be going to college right now for that. Maybe I'll get a job being, working at Best Buy or something, like, something that's gonna, because I'm somewhat interested in computers, but like clearly I don't want to be a programmer. So let me actually like get a job, get an entry-level position and kind of figure this out. And then when I finally decide, oh, actually, you know what, I do want to be a teacher, because I worked at these summer camps a couple summers. Yeah. And then you go full force into becoming a teacher and whatever certifications you need, you've got this lump sum of money that you can kind of put down for further education, but you're not just committing 4 years up front to, because it does seem like most people kind of just do the 4 years straight no matter what. At least when I was, coming up in school, that was the thing. It's like, even something like doing a semester abroad or a gap year or anything like that was pretty rare compared to what I think is a little bit more normalized now. But, to have this, to break it up in that way and just say like, okay, it's cool to just, to save all this money up to go to put towards education, but maybe it doesn't have to be at a 4-year institution right after high school.
I've wondered this, because one of the things you're hinting at too is, what else could you use that money with? I had a meeting with, there's this really awesome program out of SVA in visual narrative, School of Visual Arts in New York. And I met with the dean, to talk about maybe becoming a student there. It costs $70,000 to get that education. It's still tempting to me. But it's a lot of money. And, I was having a conversation with him. He was like, what other programs are you looking at? And I was like, I'm actually looking at what else I might do with $70,000. Like, this is actually, at the time I was like, this is the only program I'm looking at. And, I've wondered like, there's weird psychological stuff around it. So for example, let's say that I posted on social media, like, hey guys, I'm going back to school to get my master's. I feel like lots of people would be like, whoa, that's so cool. Like, I think it would be cool. I think it'd be super fascinating. I'd love to do it. I think a lot of people would be like, whoa, I respect that. Like, you've been out of school so long and now you're suddenly going back. Like, it's a cool narrative, right? If I posted on Facebook, I'm going to just not earn money and my family's going to go into debt for a few years until it's hit about like $70K in debt. And during that time, I'm going to like read books and make stuff and talk to people. I think there would be like an intervention. Like, I think people would be like, yo, Saleem, you've got to take care of your family. Like, you can't just you got 2 kids, man. But we're saying the same thing, and one has that officializer on it, right? And like there's all these theories about what college does and doesn't do, right? So one theory is that it does nothing. Like one theory is that it's what it is for in a lot of cases, which is a condensed 4-year education that makes you better at doing things. Another though is that it's like a sorting system. Like it just tells an employer like, oh, this person is reasonably on time enough to complete things for 4 years and get a degree.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Or they are like very good at like charming their teachers and advisors.
Right.
And then the other is, that it's like this officializer. And that's even this like vague thing where you don't know why. But when someone says, if someone says, I have this degree from somewhere, you might not even know what goes into that degree. But some subconscious part of your brain is like, this is real.
Right.
Like when I meet someone, I've even made the mistake of like meeting people who went to film school and just assuming that they're going to know how to do a certain film job that, maybe they haven't actually had that much real world experience with, and folks who haven't been to film school, but have, just been on set or just, are super organized might have a better approach to it. So I myself, as a person who hasn't been to film school, have made that mistake of assuming that someone who's been to film school is very good at something, at all these different things when they may or may not be, I was having this conversation with a friend about business school. And again, like, I don't mean to delegitimize any of these organizations or these degrees. Like if you go in and you do the right work and the timing is right and you're not being pushed into debt, like go for it, and maybe even if you are being pushed into debt, I'm just terribly afraid of debt. And so, I was having a conversation with a friend about business school. And I was like, I just don't really fully understand what you learn in business school. Like just not that I'm doubting it. I just don't know. Like, I don't know what you learn in a master's in chemistry because I just don't know enough about chemistry. So like, what skills will you come out of business school with? And he was like, actually, it's not about the skills. It's about the network. I was like, oh, cool. How much is business school? Well, I think I'll spend about $120K on it. Bro, give me $120K and tell me who you want me to meet, and I'll meet them for what? Like, I'll just throw $10,000 parties for 12 weeks. If I threw a $10,000 party and invited people, I mean, I don't know. There's got to be some way to make if $120K is just to meet people, and I know it's circumstantial. Like when you meet someone. And it's like contextual, right? So like if you meet me and I'm like hosting a podcast or making a film, like you might not think of me as a business person, right? So it's contextual. Like you can have great respect for someone, but not have it be in the business context. And then you won't approach me about a business deal or whatever. But even given all that, man, it just seems like when the answer is just, it's for the network or like, that's where it does seem like if you're super rich then great, but like it's and I'm not dunking on anyone who's made the decision because clearly it works for a lot of people, but it just seems very high risk,
Yeah, I agree, and I think that you made this point to me a few years ago, and it really stuck with me. You were talking about a similar idea, maybe the same idea about like, could you pay $20,000 to go back to school, or could you pay somebody who you admire like $20,000 to like be their apprentice for 6 months or something? Like how to your point about networking, like is there a way to get a more direct have more direct access to the information and the guidance that you want, as opposed to having to go through this giant institution or all these different loopholes that may only give you 30% of what you're actually looking for, but it has, this prestigious university's name written on it. And so that, does something to your point about like contextualizing and officializing that degree or that like, badge that you're wearing. That's what a lot of your money seems to be going towards.
Yeah, and again, if it works for you, it works, and that's awesome. There's no fault in that. It's everything that works in the world, that you've done without harming other people is great, good. So I remember like one of the things around that conversation was like, what if I just chose filmmakers who were just a little bit better than me or significantly better than me? There's plenty of those who exist, and I could just be like, hey, I'm going to give you $1,000 a month for 12 months. And I'm going to choose 3 different filmmakers. So, each filmmaker I spend 4 months with, I give them $1,000 a month, and the only conditions are I get to hang out with them for at least 3 hours a day, and I'll do things they ask me to during those 3 hours. Like, that seems like a not bad deal for them, and I'd certainly learn more about their processes than, by reading about their processes. Again, I'm not necessarily advocating these. I just think that it's really cool to think super experimentally about how you might learn and how you might spend $12,000 rather than $100,000, I don't want to think about money as much as I do, but I'm a freelancer, so I have to think about money. And that really falls into that bucket that we were talking about earlier of like, if you asked me 10 years ago, like when I wasn't a freelance filmmaker, freelance, videographer, freelance podcast, whatever these things are, if you were like, oh, what's going to be one of the biggest shifts in your thinking? I would not have guessed how much time I had to spend thinking about money and thinking about business and and I don't mean that in like, you would assume that I live a much more glamorous life than I do if you hear how much I have to think about this stuff sometimes. But even just to survive while you're not making that much money, you have to think about money a lot, I mean, even though I feel like I've been quite lucky, there were definitely times when, I quit my day job, and I think a week and a half later, my wife was like, hey, so we're having a baby. And when I told my boss at the day job I was working at Duke at the time, she was like, you can stay. Like, you can take back your quitting because you should probably do that.
You can take back your quitting.
So, we think about the things that we're risking. And, if you're about to jump across a ravine, you're going to be focusing mainly on that ravine and the life you're risking, right? Like, and so when you're a freelancer, you're risking your income all the time. Like, I don't know if the podcast I'm working on, I don't know if it's going to get a season 2. Like, that's outside of my control. And so you effectively get fired. Like, you don't want to think in these negative terms, but like in a certain way of thinking, like, I get fired like every Tuesday, like approximately. Like, I still, like it's I don't really know what's going to come up next. So you do kind of have to have this like weird okayness with uncertainty.
Yeah, I have always really admired your ability to think outside the box, or just your willingness to push the envelope a little bit when it comes to things like creative entrepreneurship, like education. And I'm wondering how that has changed for you. You talked a little bit about it, going from having a day job to being a freelancer, but maybe in your career as a whole, how your approach to your work has changed, how you've adapted to the technology that is available, filmmaking, I think in particular, with folks filming a lot of things now on their phones, maybe a phone cinematography hasn't quite reached, Marvel movies aren't being shot on iPhone 12s, but like we're getting there. And so I'm wondering how you're with the experimental lens that you tend to have with things, how has your approach changed over the years as you're adapting to all these new platforms and technologies?
I think, one of the things I heard early on was make more money than you spend every day that you can. Which, again, that sounds super materialistic. It seems so silly to be talking so much about money, but that's just like what you end up thinking about, right? So my take on that is to just try and have as much fun while I'm following that rule as possible, you know? And the numbers, of course, have to change. Like when I first moved to Durham, I will not name who was involved in this, and it's totally cool. It was like so long ago. But like I had a photo gig that was supposed to pay me like $30. And I showed up and they were like, we'll pay you next time. And we'll just pay you double and just shoot both events. And then in the middle of the second event, and again, like I'm not trying to dunk on this person. They were in a stressful situation. They came up to me and they were like, actually, I'm sorry. Like you can just stop photographing. We can't pay you. And I was like, but I'm already here. Like I drove out here. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to keep shooting. And then they were like, hey, you smoke? And I was like, yo, I mean, you can't pay me in weed for this gig. Like I need to pay rent. Like I can't have just moved here and now be, forced to be a dealer to get rent. Like it's just an absurd situation. I was like, look, it's good. Don't worry about it. We're good. Okay, cool. So obviously, you can't survive. You have to think like about increasing amounts of cash or whatever, but you don't always have to think about increasing the cost of all the equipment involved and stuff like that. You are correct in that like a lot of things can be done on an iPhone. Like, I started out in like, whatever, let's say it's like 2012, so 2011, somewhere around there, maybe a little earlier. I borrowed $600 to get a camera, and that camera and lens is what we shot. Eventually we shot Beat Making Lab, which was a PBS digital series where it traveled all around the world filming rappers and beat makers. But that to adjust with just shooting with one fixed lens, you're like moving really close to people and moving really, really far away. There were times though that those constraints made me make more interesting stuff. The fact that I didn't have a great zoom lens meant that I was getting really close to people all the time and couldn't be far away from the action. And that makes you change up your angles a bunch. You couldn't even, like, it was just a fixed 50 millimeter lens, so you can't zoom, so it made me a very physical shooter that I shot with that for years. You come really close to people and then you go really, really far away, and it just gets you moving in interesting ways. So I'm a huge fan of technological constraints. And to answer your question about how I'm evolving with the changing tools, one huge thing is that I work a bunch more in teams. And there's that classic line of like, if you're the smartest person in a room, you're in the wrong room. Mm-hmm. I'm just always trying to work with people who are better than me at something, whether, a lot of these people are folks around Durham that you'll know, Mandy Paget, amazing, she's a great editor and also just amazing at like making stuff run on time and figuring out how to practically get a production done. So we've collaborated a bunch, Ish or Ned, these are like DPs in the area. And so for highly technical shoots, I now bring in somebody who's handling that more technical stuff. But to answer your bigger question of like, what am I doing about the shifting of technology and keeping up with it? The core for me is still the same, of trying to find interesting angles on things. And no matter how big or small a budget is, your job's like to get a thing made and to get a thing done and to have fun. Your job isn't necessarily to have fun. It's not always going to be fun, but like I've got to find some point of fun in there, right? Like there might be some miserable stuff happening, but for me, there's got to be some way to have fun while doing it. And hopefully that's coming through in the work.
Does that change? Not does that change, but how do you think about social media and the way that you're presenting your work as well? So not just the change in technology in terms of cameras, camera equipment, microphones, that sort of thing, but also like, how am I creating to best adapt to the way that people are receiving the thing that I'm making as well?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because something I've been thinking about over the past few days is like, this is going to sound very weird coming from me, but like, what's the point of a music video? Are we still, even the music videos have had these interesting kind of eras, right? Like, so you could look at the 80s and 90s when people were spending crazy amounts of money on music videos. And then eventually the market kind of fell out of the music industry, right? The music industry started making a lot less money. Then there was this weird blip where like around 2010 where DSLR era started. So everybody's getting these relatively cheap, I don't want to disregard the cost they do have, but you could get into the game for like $600. You're getting a pretty decent DSLR, and you're maybe shooting something that is surprisingly close. I don't think it's not necessarily the same quality of image, but it's surprising. If people are I mean in the most literal sense, people see it and they're surprised that you're able to do it, right? And so that second bump is an era where all of a sudden so many more people are able to make music videos, right? And that's kind of extended close up to now. But the biggest thing that's changed is the thing you're alluding to, and it's how people consume them. Like how they're being made is interesting, and the fact that there's many, 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 many more music videos than there were 10, 15 years ago. 15 years ago, if you were like, oh, 3 of my friends have released music videos this year, that meant that you were in the mix and you know
Right.
musicians with record deals. But like now it just means like, oh, you hang out with, like releasing a music video is almost the same now as like recording yourself playing and singing guitar on a tape deck in the 80s. It's almost an equivalently easy thing to do at the base level of doing it, right? So your question is really tricky because I do, to some degree, have to think of how people are going to see my work. That's super important, right? And especially since some of the stuff I'm selling to clients, I have to think about how people are going to see it. And I have to think audience first. Like I can't just think about the client. I've got to think about who's watching this and how are they going to see it. At the same time, you don't want to psych yourself out. So I am constantly trying to find spaces where, you mentioned Tune and Law, so I'll get really Durham specific, right? Tune, aka Carell, aka Lord Fess. We made so many projects together. And it was an environment where not every project had to hit. And all that's, when I say hit, it's in the relative sense, right? For where his career was at the time, right? It is very, very, very hard to make a music video that is definitely going to be a hit. I don't know how to do that actually, so I encourage people to be like, who do you need to see this music video? What's actually like valuable for you, right? And let's get in an environment where we make 4 or 5 music videos together. And then we can get really weird and we can be really experimental. And you don't care if 3 of them don't work, if 2 of them really, really work. And depending on your relationship with the artist, like that could shift what percentage you need to have hit, right? But that's where I think stuff gets really interesting. I anytime I feel like, oh, I know what I'm doing, as far as there's different kinds of confidence with this stuff, but like, so it's good to be confident and be like, I'm executing something that I'm really into. And I love that feeling of feeling like, oh, this is going to go. This is going to work. There's something here. I love that feeling. There's a second kind of thing that I'm wary of, which is I've noticed that if there's a time that I say like, oh, I'm good at what I do. I'm that dude. Like I'm doing it. The rug's about to come out from under me anytime I've had that feeling. Does that make sense?
Yeah, oh, totally. Is there a music video that people might know where you felt like going into it, not necessarily that you were feeling yourself, but you were just like, I like this concept. I think this has a lot of potential, and you were able to execute it and it did what you thought it would do?
Yeah, so to be really clear, you're asking about one where I was talking about the good version of that, where I feel like I'm not thinking about myself. I'm thinking about like the concept.
Yeah.
It's like the moment is working.
Right.
I will say that when we watched playback on North Cap,
I was going to ask, I mean, that feels like the obvious answer, but yeah.
Yeah, when we watched that, I mean, I didn't know it was going to be, like, and a lot of this has to do with the quality of the song. I didn't know it was going to be like DJ Jazzy Jeff retweeting the video and like, it really, really going. Millions of hits on Facebook. When we watched that back, we all knew it was something, though. We all knew it was something. And then another one that was recent that didn't do numbers, but that I just feel really happy with. We just did a video for Kane Smigo, Collard Green Music, where we built the city of Durham out of cardboard, and Jiggetto made this crazy mask. And like once we watched that composite, I think we all knew it's a different kind of thing. Like I didn't necessarily feel like, oh, this is going to make us known, but I did feel like, oh, we really did what we wanted to do. And everybody, I think, is really happy with when that came out. That is not connected to making any of us a particular amount of money, but it's a feeling that if I could get that feeling all day. I made this I made this weird video about Peeps, where I animated Peeps,
the sugary snack.
The sugary snack, yeah. And made it's called Peep Lord. It's about this crazy peep monster. When I was making it, I was so confident that my friends would laugh at it. And they did. And that's all that video is ever going to do, is just make a certain group of my friends laugh. And it's never going to turn into anything else. But that feeling is just as good as any of the other feelings, When you feel like, oh, I know what this video needs to do, and we're doing it, and I feel great about it. That's a good feeling.
Funny you say that, because I think this was last night. Tommy and I, my roommate, we were watching these random, I don't know how we got down this rabbit hole of, YouTube is just a constant stream of rabbit holes, but we were watching these videos and we were just like, we don't know what the hell's going on, but they're kind of funny, and the guys that make this must just really enjoy doing it. And you kind of got that. It was these weird animations. I think the YouTuber's Joel Haver is the account, and they're just so bizarre. But you can tell, like, no matter how many streams they get, they're probably just having the time of their life putting these together. And I do think that there's a certain amount of, you want to always be authentic in the stuff that you make. And so ideally, the more authentic you are, and the more people recognize that. And, I think people gravitate towards that kind of work. I think people can tell when something is authentic and when it's not. And I get the feeling that for the most part, people are drawn towards authenticity. And so you want to always prioritize that. And it seems like that's something that you have done, maybe even in the face of, shifting trends, or, working in a field like hip hop, where I think that people have a certain impression of what a hip hop music video looks like. And you have been able to flip that on its head numerous times. And then from that, people continue to come back to your work because they're like, yeah, I'm going to get something I've never seen before if I watch a Kid Ethnic produced music video.
Well, I'll say that I've definitely not always achieved, the times that I haven't achieved what I wanted were when I went too conservative, when I kind of felt like I knew how to do something, and okay, I kind of get what the client wants, and we're not all the way there with concept, and they've been competent videos, but the question of how to make authentic work is really hard. It's easy to say that you want to make something authentic, but there's a few things that can happen. One, you can get in a pattern where you've made a certain kind of thing, or you're having a certain kind of inputs, right? So like Instagram can be amazing and it can be dangerous. Like it's Instagram is who you follow, right? Like what it is to some degree. But like it's not always easy to know who you are. There's times when I get a weird vibe where I'm like, wait, is this authentic? Like, no, wait, I'm just stuck in a pattern.
Yeah.
It's not, and I think people are very drawn to authentic things, but if you think of the most authentic people that one of them drives you insane, right? Like they're totally being themselves, and who they are makes you crazy.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't fully know how to, I'm not saying anything clear with that, except that, I do think that people are drawn to being authentic, and I think that's what we should all be. It's a concept that's hard to put into practice sometimes, because sometimes you're going to do something authentic and then it's tied to vulnerability, right? So if I make something and it's like 70% good, right? And okay, like it's reasonably received. Anybody who sees it feels like, oh, the person who made this is a competent video maker. That's not going to hurt my career. That's just like, it's almost like it didn't happen, right? Like if it's like, it's just a thing that gets done for money, right? if I go all out and make something really weird, it can happen that people are just going to be like, I don't like that. And maybe it doesn't even work. Maybe there's two possibilities. One is that I'm trying to execute a weird vision and it doesn't work. And that feels terrible when something's not working, right? Because, this whole team, it's so different from it feels terrible no matter what the art form is, but film is such a collaborative art form. And even when I'm working with what is, for practical purposes, a no budget video, which, they're not no budget, but the amount of money they're making compared to the amount of food we're eating as a crew, that budget starts looking really small real quick, Even then, the artist has put in their time, the crew has put in their time, I've put in time. And so it's so hard when stuff doesn't work. And so it is tricky to stay kind of quote unquote authentic, and that's the ideal. And I'm happier when I'm doing that. But I have had some misses, man. And sometimes those misses hurt. And they can throw you for it's not for me, and I'm not saying this is how people should be. I'm just describing a unfortunate situation. I'll be like, oh, cool. For 8 months, I'm just going to feel terrible and not take risks. Great. Here we go. So I'm really intrigued in figuring out how we can make ourselves create authentic work and what kind of practices help us create that work. And I know for me, I don't want to sound like I'm raging against Twitter or whatever, but if I'm on Twitter all day, that doesn't fill my cup in the right way. Now I actually do know people who are really amazing at being online all the time, and they don't seem to be, they seem to be totally able to do everything that I wish I could do. So I'm just speaking of myself, but I have found that
I think you're also speaking directly to me.
Well, that's up to you, but I could just, the only thing I really know is that I know it messes me up. And but if I carve out time to force myself, if I haven't written for a while and I'll write and it's wow, this is all really crappy. But if I keep at it and I keep pushing this happened the other day. I walked downtown with a notebook and I started writing and I could feel that it was all crappy. And eventually I broke through and wrote down a new thought to me. I don't remember what it was. Hopefully I can find the notebook. I wrote a thought that was new to me and I felt my head clearing. And it's just, this is such a cliche to say, but it's having that discipline to go through these processes does help you pull out authentic material.
Something that I've been wrestling with a lot when it comes to authenticity and how to present it is my hometown and your longtime home of Durham and how it's changed over the last decade or so. For me, coming into the scene, so to speak, the growing downtown, working with Gabe at Runaway around sort of 2010, 2011. Through the end of the decade, Durham has transformed in a number of ways. And I know it's something that you and I talk about all the time, because of how it's, shaped the way that we think about our home, but just also think about the way that this is a microcosm or a representation of the way that America is transforming in numerous ways. And I'm wondering if there are things that in the last decade that you are particularly proud of or excited about with the way that Durham has changed, and then maybe something that you're man, we really messed that up, or I wish we could take that back, or we didn't quite execute that the way that I thought we would when all this stuff happened or started 10 years ago.
Man, it's a great question. I really moved here 10 years ago, and as far as Durham proper, and I often think of, my kids were all born here. My wedding was at Tandura down the road. It's just many life events have happened since I've come here. I do sometimes think of myself as a guest here, and I don't think, not in the negative sense that I've been like excluded or anything like that, but more in just the sense that I want to be really respectful of the folks who were here before and were doing tons of cool work way before I got here, and important work and all of those things. So it's interesting because 10 years is a very long time, and new humans have come into this earth in our family in that time. But I also just try to, make sure and respect that other folks have been doing the work here a long time. The question is challenging for me because I hesitate to be dismissive. It's easy to be like I've seen these things that are like, oh, Durham is over because this certain building was put up or whatever. And I don't believe that at all, not for a second. I don't think... I mean, I get what those folks are saying, when they say that.
That used to be me pretty strongly, I think, for a lot of the decade, was like, this is all bad. All growth is bad. Everyone moving here is bad. Just like, get off my lawn. Let's put up a wall. Like I was pretty adamantly against any change. And it was not healthy, I don't think.
Well, it's a really tricky question, and I want to be very careful with a certain subtlety here. Is I'm actually not talking about people who are from here who were against change. I'm talking about folks who moved here, and that's actually, you just raised a really important distinction, and I'm happy to talk about either of these paths. But you're speaking from the point of view of someone who's been here the whole time, and I should have been clearer in that this is a very important distinction. That I'm talking about folks who moved here around the same time I did, who maybe are like, oh, the city's over, I'm out, or whatever, We can all make our own decisions about where to stay or go or all that kind of stuff. I'm not judging anybody for that type of thing. But I am saying, like, that almost feels like it disregards things that were here before, and continue to be here. And the other thing is, like, I respect that feeling, and I understand that feeling, and I also feel that feeling of, like, when I walk downtown, I'm like, oh, this doesn't feel like a place that could birth a new Pinhook, right? When it doesn't feel necessarily like, what are the chances that another club like that is going to pop up downtown in the current environment? It seems pretty hard, right? So those things are definite downers for me. What I mean when I say that I don't like, and again, I'm primarily talking about folks who've moved maybe around the same time as me or later or earlier or whatever, but like, I'm not speaking about people who have lived here their whole lives. It's a little too easy of a narrative to complain about some of these things without being politically active. And I'm also not complaining. I'm not speaking about people who've been politically active fighting against these things and they're frustrated that they came to pass despite all their hard work. I'm talking more about like people like myself who I, went through a chunk of time of attending city council meetings and realized, like, wow, I haven't been doing that at all before this, And so I'm specifically talking about a sliver that's like, if you have the time to be politically active, and I include myself in this, I'm not as politically active as I should be. You can't just dismiss a city because a building pops up. Like, you either got to put in the work. Basically the answer is that we should all be putting in the work. And I'm not, again, this is such a delicate thing because I would never say that to someone who's from here. I would also not say that to someone who's working at it. But what I am saying is, like, before just dismissing your city because something's happened in one particular area, it doesn't mean that you have to feel that it's a good thing, but like that, if, like me, you haven't been doing all you can to make the city what you want it to be. Like, I think all of us can be doing more. And I think people who've moved here more recently, which oddly, I even though it's 10 years, I consider myself fairly recent compared to some folks. I don't want to have moved here and then complain about it. Does that make sense? That distinction?
Totally. Yeah. And I think you're right to say that there are just so many nuances to the conversation around like who a city belongs to and sort of who
Yeah,
has the
it's
right
really challenging.
to exclaim these various things. And so, yeah, it is super complicated. Even for me, I feel like my perspective changes on a week to week basis based on who I talk to. I finally got a chance to meet some of our neighbors here on Holloway Street, and it was like, man, like these people are super interesting and have like done pretty cool things in their life, and some of them aren't from Durham and like got here by way of Duke, and I am a person who has frequently like judged Duke students and people that are associated with Duke in some way for being gentrifiers or disrespectful and to the larger Durham community, and so it's like you can make these broad generalizations about what you think is happening or who you think is committing these acts, but then you get on the ground level and you start to actually have conversations with people, and it's like, man, this is actually way more complicated, because I wouldn't wish any of these people away from Durham. Like, they bring incredible gifts and skills and life stories to this tapestry. And that's ultimately, for me, what I think Durham is and should be, is like a rich tapestry of diverse perspectives. And so if they are bringing more of that to Durham, who am I to say they don't belong here? That doesn't, that is, I think, where like the distinction between individuals coming here and like certain, market forces or like other sort of larger, more intangible entities make their presence known. That's, I think, where it starts to get, the water starts to get muddier for me, and it's like harder for me to fully articulate how I feel about something. Because you're right, it is just a building going up, but there's like something about a particular building owned by a particular group
Valid.
that that you're like, okay, what does this say about where this neighborhood is headed and the types of businesses that move into it? What does that say about how this neighborhood will change and what type of jobs will be available and that sort of thing? So yeah, but that doesn't remove the complicated nature of the conversation, but it does start to, depending on whether you're looking at a micro level or a macro level, changes the perspective a little bit.
Based on what you just said, like, I should soften my position. You're changing my mind about a certain thing, actually, and yeah, I think maybe I'm overreacting to like what I just don't want. Here's what I should be. You've helped me clarify a thought, really, and let's proverbially like just throw out what I said before, and maybe this is the thing that is a clearer thought that you've helped get me to, which is I just don't want people to give up on the city, and I can say that without dismissing anyone's feelings, right? Like, and especially like the incredibly important legacy feelings that folks have. And here we're going to quickly get out of my depth, but I don't think it's possible to have a really real conversation about this stuff without talking about housing and reparations. And, if housing was affordable, and if there wasn't the racial divide that is as we know, the historic residue of America's original and many following sins that results in Black folks not having as much money as they deserve for the work they have put into the world, I think the discussion around Durham would be so different. Like if there wasn't a racial split that caused some people to be more likely to not be able to afford housing here, and cause some people to, and I can be very specific, and it's not only Black folks, but it's definitely Black folks are included in the groups that have been excluded and primarily excluded by the American system. It sounds weird to go so macro on a discussion of one town, but how different would the discussion be if there were just huge numbers of if there were even more amazing black businesses being created now in downtown Durham. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I think that that this problem is certainly not unique to Durham. And that's why I prefaced all this with saying, like, Durham is this, I think Durham has represented a certain shift for a lot of small to mid-sized towns throughout the country that have faced a certain amount of growth, but that also have a diverse population that is not equally receiving the benefits of said growth. And, I wonder if this sort of gets me thinking about Durham and what it means to be a part of the Durham community. And I'm wondering for you, having been, being the son of immigrant parents and having a mixed race household yourself now, also coming from that, thinking even broader outside of Durham, what do you think that it means for you? Because I feel like you constantly bring very unique perspectives to these topics that we've covered today. And just like one of the things I really enjoy about conversations that we have is the amount of perspective that you're able to bring for a given topic, whether it be, education, jobs, traveling, living in a city, being a citizen. We haven't had the opportunity yet to go through your entire work history, but like, working at 17 magazine is just like a pretty, it's a pretty unique thing for people that, at least that I know, and, working on a cruise ship and then, making, music videos for local rappers and just like, now having
it's
a
weird
podcast.
resume.
Yeah. Like having this podcast with Ted. And, I don't know, there's just like this enormous variability of your experience and your perspective. And I'm wondering how you're able to, I don't know, like not rationalize, but like bundle all those things up and then like use those experiences to articulate what it means to, whether it be like, be a citizen of Durham, be a person that works in multimedia, a citizen of this country. Like, how do you think all this variability has shaped the way that you sort of like present yourself to the world in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question, man. I think of myself as a person who has made mistakes in many locations and fields. And in that process, I've gotten to kind of see what it's like to see the world from different perspectives to some degree. You can never actually know what someone else's perspective is. Like 100% empathy is very, very, is like a super ideal, but like I've gotten to spend time with a lot of different people. Man, it's a really interesting question because you're touching on something that's almost like, related to things like code switching, because we're all such different people in such different, in different circumstances, right? Like I'm going to, after this call, I'm going to walk in the house, I'm going to speak, imperfect Japanese to my family and then, send a formal email. And I'm saying really obvious things, but like we're all such different people in different situations. And so if you're asking, and feel free to jump in and adjust this answer if it's veering too far, but if you're asking how does that fit into a community, which seems to be kind of like the bigger question of what you were asking, like how do you fit, like I always think the way you fit into a community is by listening and trying to do what you do the best you can. Like that's like the whole ingredient. That's like all of it, right? Like listen, be respectful, and try to do what you can and have fun with people and, break bread with them. And you're asking this at such an interesting time because I myself have had a feeling of like, how do you make your life feel like it's adding up to something in this quarantine year? I've definitely had times this year where I'm like, what is this adding up to? There's like a cumulative feeling. And this is an interesting tension, right? Like one expression of like a cumulative feeling of things adding up to something would be like accomplishments, right? Another might be some internal thing of like, oh, I feel like I'm a little better at what I did yesterday I'm better today than I was yesterday at this thing or that thing. And then the other kind of thing that's outside of all that is this idea of being in the moment. And what I want to feel in a community is that I can go out in that community, be in the moment and be okay. You know, that no one's going to harm me or even get like excessively angry at me. Like if I say something dumb in this podcast, hopefully people will be, Twitter being what it is, who knows, but like hopefully people will be forgiving. And like community for me is a lot about forgiving. That doesn't mean that you if everyone knows that there's a certain amount of forgiving, then people can be free, you know? That doesn't mean that things don't have consequences.
I'm assuming that's a Saleem original.
I made it up, so it might also be incredibly stupid 5 minutes from now. So I don't know. Hopefully I didn't steal it from somebody. If I did, thank you to them. But also many things that sound great in the moment sound terrible 5 minutes later. So we'll see. But I do think that, it doesn't mean that every apology is going to be accepted or all these, all these like, current things that people are talking about that are, all super important. But I do think that like having a community where people are trying not to make mistakes and are allowed to make mistakes is such a huge part of community for me. And I feel like, I can't say enough how welcoming Durham has been to me. In a certain way, this is going to like, there may be good or bad things about this. I don't know. But like, I think despite like, age differences among the people involved and all that, like there was almost like a certain, like it's almost like a certain class around like class in the sense of like a school class around like a group of things that were kind of coming up around 2010, and I don't know why I was welcomed into that class, but it feels lucky to have been in that class. And, I want to loop back and make sure that I'm thinking about, I'm answering your question in the sense of like, for any of us having done the things we've done in life, which are all more varied than they may at first appear. The person who has had the exact same job for 40 years has a completely different life has a different experience that they've gained by that. Like to do one thing repeated for 40 days is a different thing to have done one thing repeated for 41 days. And those two people have different experiences, so every kind of experience is variable if you dive deep enough into it, or if you think about it enough, or if you observe it with enough care. And so looping back to your question of community and how all that fits in, I think it's pretty much the same no matter what your background is. But I think what we all want is a place where we can, feel respected, not in the sense of like being famous or something goofy like that, but just feel like, people are going to treat us with respect. We're going to, be allowed to make some mistakes, because getting back to your question of authenticity, like being authentic means you're going to mess some things up, or you're going to say something that's not, you're going to tell some story that's, if you're really, here's a great way to think about it. A comedian, when they're in an audience of comedians and they're kind of trying out material, they're not funny all the time. Like some of their jokes fall really flat and they still need some work, right? But that's a great community. And that's a great creative community, a place where you can build yourself into the kind of person you want to be. That's not a community where people are saying known hurtful things to each other. That's a very different thing. I'm certainly not expressing like some kind of weird permission to say crazy stuff without circumstances. But that's a very roundabout answer. But I do think that the thing that ties kind of authenticity to community and varied past experience is just like people listening to each other and allowing each other to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And then changing when someone else points out a mistake, like trying to fix that.
Yeah, totally. I think that that's a place where in communities across the country, we have lost our way a bit, is giving people grace and an opportunity to make a mistake or grow and learn. Like you said, I mean, seems like every week somebody is getting, quote unquote canceled online for something, sometimes worthwhile, and then sometimes seemingly, innocent, or just like a mistake that one would make if they don't have an experience that would give them a different perspective. And I think Twitter specifically, but just like internet culture in general, has made it way too easy, and for us to decide that like people everyone has this incredibly short leash, and we're just like not allowed any mistakes, because and we're all irredeemable, and only get one chance to, I don't know, exist in the world.
And I think one interesting thing is I think maybe I make the mistake of worrying too much about of talking, rather than what I should be doing. Even in a conversation like this, it occurs to me that maybe I should be focusing more on shining a light on how people are building communities where people help each other. That stuff is, all that good stuff is still happening. And I think it's easy for me myself to get distracted and complain about some of these negative, gigantic forces. But I'm super fascinated by folks who, I think Monet, in Durham, her work is amazing at opening conversations. And I'd like to figure out how to get my brain to doing more noticing of those kind of bright spots, and kind of building up those bright spots and trying to reverse engineer bright spots, and switch my brain into doing more of that.
Yeah, I wonder what it is that elicits, what it is about rage that is stronger, it seems, than genuine excitement or happiness. Because to your point, it does seem like a thing that makes us happy online, we will, favorite it or retweet it or repost it, and that's the extent of it. But if it's something we don't like, I actually saved, there was a tweet that you quoted. It was about, if you wanted to meet, if you wanted to have a conversation with every person in the world that had 6 fingers, you would tweet, people have 5 fingers, or every person has 5 fingers, something like that. And basically every person that had 6 fingers would come out of the woodwork to, rebuke it or stand up for themselves. But, all the people who have 5 fingers would just be like, yeah, you're right. Okay. I'll favorite it and just kind of move on. And so I think that there's this, I'm sure that there's, there are behavioral psychologists that can tell us why, but I'm in the dark on what it is about I guess it's maybe when our identity is threatened, or something about us that just our rage on the internet seems to be amplified much more than our genuine excitement. And that's unfortunate, because it would be nice to return to a place where those happy moments are overwhelming the discourse.
And, rage is obviously very productive at times, when focused in the right ways. And it's, often people dismiss the times that rage seems to have gotten amazing things done for people's freedom and things like that. I think that what I'm really curious about every time in these conversations where, you've mentioned you're wrestling with something, or we're trying to figure something, those are all the times I'm super fascinated by, right? So the thing that I really want to, we're going to basically be rebuilding in a very strange way, not in a physical structure way, but we have a restart. A lot of people have had, it's not necessarily a restart in the fresh start way, but many people are in terrible situations right now in Durham. We're not physically interacting with each other, and that physical interaction is what's about to restart in, hopefully after we're all vaccinated to a certain percentage or whatever, not to get into those kind of debates, yeah. But in my opinion, that's the thing, that whatever the thing is that gets us, all back able to interact. And so maybe a thing we can do is just really focus on building the kinds of interactions that we want to have as a city going forward, since we have had this really, again, not positive, insanely terribly bad situation. but it does mean that we have a reason to start from zero and just really I really want to go into whatever's next with intention and try and figure out how we want the city to be and how we can just interact in positive ways as much as possible.
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations this week about that exact thing, both on personal level and for some businesses, and how they're thinking about, what will it be like to have folks return to our physical locations, and how do we reshape those interactions, and how do we rebuild those communities even before we're allowed to? Is there a way to build digital communities that port easily back to the physical world and vice versa, and not necessarily thinking about them as two separate things, but how do we leverage the technology that we do have to have conversations with folks, electronically, and then use that momentum or that leverage to your point, rethink how we're going to show up and be more intentional in the physical spaces that we previously occupied. So I think that's a really good observation and way to think about what the near future might hold.
Yeah, man, we definitely have a mission,
I think with your myriad of experiences, like I mentioned before, I would love to close out the conversation by asking you what or who are some of your greatest influences as a multimedia producer, storyteller, creative at large?
Yeah, goodness, there's a ton. I think really broadly, when thinking about influences that influence my work, they're not necessarily filmmakers, or that some of them are media makers. They might not be doing things that are very similar to what I'm doing, I can answer to who's influenced me recently. Like Boots Riley, Sorry to Bother You was just like a amazing thing to see. In that film, there's a tribute to Michel Gondry. In the middle of the film, there's a stop motion, and he has a joking reference to some name that's almost like Michel Gondry. And Michel Gondry is a director who, I'm not sure if you're familiar with their work, but very unusual music videos. Did this film called Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Just super physical, hands-on. Yeah, super physical, hands-on strangeness. That whole vibe, his music video DVD really influenced me. A filmmaker named Miranda July. Is that how you say her name? I don't know how to say her name, but it's Miranda July is how it looks when it's written out. It's just like this unusual. She's an unusual multimedia artist. Again, like I'm really interested in when people are making art that the actual making of the art is very physical or unusual in the real world. Like my favorite thing about North Cac is that people had to sprint in circles to make it. Like that really had to happen. Like it's not, you can't just click a mouse and have it happen.
Right. What about folks that are not in multimedia necessarily?
Yeah. Let's see. Great question. So I just read a book by the writer Kelly Link. Just very unusual stories. I think I know she was educated in North Carolina. She might actually be from North Carolina. Very unusual kind of fantastical stories. I'm reading some Octavia Butler right now, which is also just amazing to see people really push. I'm reading her short story book. I think it's called Blood something. The thing that binds them, I think, is they're folks who are just really kind of trying to bend a medium and make highly unusual, very physical descriptions of fantastical things. That's super inspiring to me. The writer George Saunders had a great book called The Brain Dead Megaphone. It's another one.
Yeah.
Jim Henson, like all these kind of, and then lots of folks I know. Jaghetto, speaking of a Henson adjacent
Right.
person, in Chapel Hill, the puppeteer there. My friend Juliana Vision, who is a filmmaker. Yeah, it's just it. Again, these are all people who, when they make their work, the writers aside, and speaking of like the filmmakers or multimedia people, something physical changes in the world in the process of them making their work, and that's beautiful and fascinating to me.
That's super cool. Yeah, I have been thinking a lot more about, we alluded to this a bit when we were talking about social media, and you're influenced on those platforms by the people you follow, and a lot of your quote unquote authenticity comes from absorbing these influences and reimagining them through your own lens. And so I've been thinking a lot about that this year in the things that I'm reading and the things that I'm watching, as I'm working through building this podcast and this Buddy Ruski brand on the whole. Like, who are my, like, quote unquote elders, so to speak, in this medium, and how do I become more familiar with their work, and not to necessarily copy them or like rip off their stuff, but just like, these are the things that I claim that I am interested in. Maybe I should be more diligent about like understanding who came before me and what were their processes, and who are experimenting in weird ways with storytelling and podcasting, and or even just like creativity in general. I've been listening to a lot of Dan the Automator produce stuff recently.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite producers.
Yeah, he's one of those guys that, I think a lot of people have probably heard songs that he's produced and just not known who he was. And but I find approaches each project in a very particular way, and seems to be very he is both prolific but also very intentional about the projects that he takes on. And I appreciate that approach to creativity, because I do think right now this is something that I struggle with constantly. I think I posted something on social about this before, the idea of like promoting the things that you've done versus constantly making new work, and like the balance of how to continue to be pushing new material out, but also like making sure that you're absorbing new influences and creating new work as well. And so with the downtime that I've had, I've definitely tried to absorb more, and just not feel like I am committed to constantly posting, constantly like being on social. I mean, I'm not doing a very good job, but yeah, just being more mindful of like, you can, the good work will rise to the surface. It doesn't have to be constant work.
And I've also wondered, with touching on what you're saying, how can, to take a very like outdated idea of this, there was a thing called like a blog ring back in the day, where like blogs would commit to promoting each other, and it got a little silly, where people were just like, feeling compelled to post whatever rando stuff anybody else in some gigantic blog ring had. But there's something there that's interesting. There was a time when we'd chat about how like the Kid Ethnic Squad and the Runaway Squad were basically a record label. I mean, almost a record label, like, and to the degree to which we were like intertwined with all these bands, all these MCs. I am curious, like, how could we, you look at these great collectives, and how being able to promote things as a collective, maybe you take some of the load off yourself if you're all promoting each other's work. I'm just really intrigued by that. And, that's another way that like we are in a particularly challenging situation in the South. We're not near a giant hub. People always say like, oh, you don't have to be in the big hubs, but it is easier to meet other people in the field in a big hub. It just is,
And that's where the money tends to gravitate towards. And you're working with a little bit less, so people's attention is, the South is a little bit lower on the list of places to check out when it comes to who's producing new things. And so I think you're right that having some sort of, because this is something, Patrick Phelps McEwen, Tree City, we talked about this. I talked to Danny Blaze about this on our last podcast. Amelia from Sylvanesso was posting about this on Instagram, all about this, the like amount of things that you're constantly keeping up with as a creative. You're not only just creating work, but if you work independently, you are, your own business manager, you're your own social media manager, you are like your own booking agent, you are, your own financial manager. Like there are all these other hats that you're wearing that, I won't say get in the way of your creativity, but are like, part of the full spectrum of what you are trying to accomplish every day. And so to your point, to like have collectives that can ease some of that.
Yeah. American Underground was a group that lightened the load of being a tech startup, right? So how can collectives lighten our loads? That's a question I'm really interested in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've covered so much, and I really want to thank you for your time and the wisdom that you. I mean, I feel really
not at all. It's been fun. It's fun to bounce around ideas with you.
No, I agree, and it's like these are the kinds of conversations that you and I have, and one of the reasons that I enjoy doing this podcast is just these are things that these are conversations that I feel like I'm very fortunate to be a part of on a regular basis with people across Durham, really, across the country. And so to be able to share these conversations and give people an opportunity to basically sit in on what I find to be very interesting topics and, the origin stories of very interesting people is a treat. And I was telling people before I got on, I was like, man, I'm pretty nervous about interviewing Saleem. I think this is the first one where I was like sweating before I got on, just because I admire your work and,
I appreciate that, but thank you.
Yeah. So thanks again for being on. And where should people go to find your work or follow what you have coming up?
Yeah, kidethnic.com, kidethnic.com is where I tend to post stuff, and Instagram gets the most movement there, but I have been trying to figure out some way to move into like back to blogging and email newsletter type stuff to try and get to where we're all owning our own material a little more. We'll see.
You're always experimenting with something, so I'm not surprised to hear you say that. Well, thanks again for being on the show, and if you haven't already, for folks that are listening, definitely check out what is now called Far Flung, Saleem's podcast on or through TED. Folks that are familiar with TED Talks, TED has a few different podcasts, I guess, that they produce, but this one is, I can say with as little bias as possible that it's a really awesome show, and you won't be disappointed to check that out. So make sure to subscribe to Far Flung and follow Saleem's work from here on out.
Thanks so much. And the latest episode has a lot of shout outs to Durham and Soul City, North Carolina. So I hope y'all enjoyed if you hear it. And thanks so much for having me on the show, man.
Of course. All right, y'all. Until next time, this has been the Buddy Ruski Show. We'll be seeing you.